Welcome to School of PE podcast. I'm your host, Chris Miller, and I'm so glad that you could join me this week. We are going to discuss topics about FE, PE, and SC, and we're also going to answer questions that will help students prepare for their exams. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the School of PE's weekly SOPE podcast. I'm Chris Miller. We got a returning guest today. Luis is back. Welcome back, Luis. And if you could just kind of catch everybody up to, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I love doing podcasts. I have podcasts on my own, and this is kind of what I love to do, just help other engineers and help them in their careers. I'm a bridge engineer located in Colorado. I've been practicing engineering for 4 years now. I got my PE license last year, and the journey has been great. A lot of struggles coming from a different country. I've been able to expand my skills, my expertise into other things that I really enjoy doing, like podcasting. I've created some courses and resources for young engineers to hopefully help them in their process as they want to become a professional engineer. And I think even after that, to continue just learning and progressing in their careers.
Fantastic. That's exciting stuff. And I always like meeting somebody that likes to kind of give back, right? Help
Mhm.
those that are doing the path that you completed. So that's pretty cool. So today we have an exciting topic. We're going to be talking about the transition for the PE Civil from paper pencil
Mhm.
to the computer based, and also maybe talk about some of the recommended study materials and maybe some pitfalls to avoid. Um, you know, it's a big change, right?
Yeah.
Over the years, NCS has been slowly transitioning other disciplines from paper, pencil to the computer base. The FE's been like this for many years, and then they move with the smaller PEs. Then all of a sudden, bam, man, PE Civil, the granddaddy of them all, is now computer based. So, um, let me ask you this, Luis: why the change from paper, pencil to CBT? Why even do that?
I'm not totally sure why, but I have a few guesses. One of them just being easier to grade. I think the
Mhm.
paper and pencil it just takes a lot of time. When I took it last year, it took I believe 6 to 7 weeks, sometimes even more for some
Wow,
people,
right.
to get the result. I think with the computer based, I think you get the results as soon as 7 days. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's a lot quicker. The other benefit I think is having it more frequently throughout the year. You don't have to wait until April or October to take it. You can take it one time each quarter, and there are numerous times during the quarter you can take it. So I think that's a big benefit, especially with people that may not pass it the first time, which I think it's. I mean, 60% pass rate is not very high. So there's a lot of people that would like to take it multiple times in a year without having to wait 6, 7 months for the second round. And I think the last one is just there's a variety of type of questions now, and the way that you go through the exams a little different, which may be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, as well as just being a closed book exam now. I think we talked about this in the last episode we recorded, but you now have just like a handbook where all the information should be there, and you're able to search the codes. Again, that can be a benefit or a drawback depending on how you like to study, how you like to keep your materials, and
Mhm.
how you best learn at the end of the day.
No, and I'm with you on that. I mean, I think also some of the logistics are gone. You
Mhm.
used to used to take more resources, right? You have to have multiple exam proctors, maybe rent exam halls. So, by using like a Pearson VUE or a Prometric testing center, it's a lot easier for candidates to get to these locations. Also, you don't need as many proctors maybe as well.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it's been a big change for sure. I think a lot of people have, they freak out, right? I mean, change is scary for anything you do, right? You move to a new, let's say you move from California to Arkansas, it's scary. Change is a fearful thing. But yeah, it's closed book. You can't take in the suitcase worth of books anymore. So learning how to navigate the NCS reference handbook is key. As you mentioned, you do have access to the codes and standards during the exam. But one of the drawbacks is that, back when it was paper pencil, you could tab everything, right?
Yeah.
You could be like, hey, I know exactly. I go to this blue tab for this code. I go to the orange tab for this code. So that is a whole new ball game for people. So I think those are some of the scary things for the PE Civil changing. But also, I agree. It used to be what in April. an October test. But
Yeah.
now, if you don't pass it in April, you could take it again here in June. So I agree. I think not having to wait those 6 months is huge, right? I mean, you fall off the horse, you can get back up much quicker than you did in the past. So I think those are great points that you had brought up. Another question I have is it comes to what is linear on the fly testing?
Yeah, and I had to look this up, and I have a few friends that actually took the exam here in the last couple of months. But that basically means is as you answer questions, I think you basically have, depending on either how you answer it or just how the test is programmed, you get different like paths
Oh,
during the exam. And so you always have different, if you're sitting next to another, let's say, civil PE exam next to you, you'll never really have the same exam. And it's like it can change as you start taking the exam, if that
oh,
makes
wow.
sense.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure if that's actually accurate, but that's kind of what I've heard. And it's challenging to think about it when you are in the exam, and then depending on how you answer, depending on how the test is programmed, you can get different paths within a similar exam. So it's a little confusing. I'm not 100% clear that, but I think that's kind of the basis of it.
Yeah, it's a pretty good explanation. It kind of reminds me of, like, for those nurses who are taking the NCLEX exam,
Mhm.
they're exams what they call dynamic, right? If you're doing really poor in a section, you get more questions on that particular subject. So it kind of adapts to your performance on the exam. So it's
Right.
interesting. What do you think some of the pros and cons of it are?
I think it allows you to maybe recover a little
Mm,
faster if you get a lot of wrong questions in a row. I think the exam just kind of adjusts depending on how you answer this question. So I really don't see a huge benefit to that, other than just being able to maybe have different types of questions as you answer them, and maybe you get a lot of good ones in a certain type of question. Maybe you don't get as many in a different type of question, but just kind of that flexibility as you take the exam.
that makes sense. That makes sense. So with the introduction or the transition to CBT computer based comes a different types of questions,
Hmm.
right? Meaning, like, not different types of questions in the sense that they're different questions, but different question types.
Right.
You used to have the multiple choice, right? A through D is a great example. But now they introduced, and these have been introduced on the FE, they are introduced on the other PEs that are computer based, but they call them AITs, alternative item type questions. So, let me ask you this, Luis, as you're preparing for the exam and you know that these AITs are going to pop up, and I think at one time it was representative 10% of the exam. So not a whole lot of AIT questions. But should you change the way you study and prepare, knowing that you're going to be coming across these AIT type questions?
I think you need to adjust a little bit, but I think this would be great for the people that like to learn visually. So, like, they like to draw diagrams, they like to draw pictures. I think they're going to see these type of questions and immediately just remember what they studied a few months back. So, it's understanding kind of the learning style and understanding how you learn best. As engineers, we are mostly kinesthetic learners, so we like to actually do the work and like
Mhm.
use our hands to do the work and actually see what's happening. But a lot of people are visual learners. A lot of people are better with words and audio. So it's just understanding where you fall into that spectrum and apply that into your learning materials, and maybe introduce a little bit of each, knowing that there may be questions that are more graphical than others, and that way you create that visual memory of the type of questions that may be asked during the exam.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. There's a great video on the NCS's website that walks you through the alternative item types, walks you through the different types of, like, drag and drop, hotspot,
Mhm.
fill in the blank, things like that. So, I get the pleasure of talking to students every day, whether it's people preparing for their FE, people preparing for their PE. And one of the questions that I've been getting a lot lately is, what kind of advice can you give somebody that's getting ready to take the computer-based format? And Luis, you've just been through it not too long ago. So can you kind of maybe, let's say if I were coming to you and say, "Hey, Luis, I'm getting ready to take my PE. It's not a paper pencil anymore." Any advice you can give?
I think the advice in terms of studying that hasn't really changed from paper and pencil to the CBT is just taking the time to really learn the material. And I
Hmm.
think this comes to, again, allowing that 3, 4, 5 months, maybe even 6 months before you take the exam to really understand the material, study without really rushing it too much, and just have a solid plan as you progress to the exam. I think that's probably the most important part. Understanding where your weaknesses are in terms of like what topics you may not remember as much from school, maybe focusing on that a little more. In my case, I actually focused probably 80 to 90% of the time on the depth portion,
Mm,
knowing that there was going to be a lot of questions in the morning section as well.
right.
I think total, in terms of actually studying for the morning session, I studied for 2 weeks, maybe 30 hours or so, and then I did a ton of problems, a ton of exams, practice after that, that allowed me to just kind of pick up the topics, what kind of questions are going to be there for those
Right.
morning bread questions that I'm not as familiar, but I know I can look it in the manual, look it in another resource. But in the afternoon, the depth portion, I felt pretty confident because I spent, again, 80-90% of the time studying for
Right.
that section.
No, that's some great advice. And what I tell people too is the exam specs didn't change, right?
Mhm.
So it's not like, what they tested you on in last October is no longer what they're testing you on today. So that hasn't changed. So you're right, your approach should stay the same. Maybe, as you said, become a little bit more familiar with the references that you do have. For
Yep.
example, the NCS reference handbook. You're going to want to become very familiar with that, understanding where certain things are. That way, during the exam, you're not spending a lot of time flipping through pages, right? Like, oh man,
Mhm.
where's this thing on geometrics, right? Or where's this project planning? So if you can become familiar with the handbook, it saves yourself some time during the exam, which I think is very helpful as well, because essentially it's a race against the clock as well, right? I mean, eventually that timer is going to hit zeros.
Mhm.
So if you can reduce the amount of time you are spending flipping through the handbook or the codes and standards, the more time you have on actually reading and answering the questions. So that's some great advice. So, here's a question, and this applies to anything that's turned closed book, whether it's, a college exam, a high school exam, or now the PE Civil. And if you can kind of think back, going back to college, Luis, and you ever have a professor say, "Hey, we're going to have a open book exam today." Did that ever happen?
From what I remember, we were allowed, for some class, we were allowed to have either a summary, like a one sheet summary of the questions, concepts, anything we
Hmm.
wanted. There were a handful of classes where we actually could have like the book and everything
Hmm.
open. But like you were saying, you need to know what the material is within the book. You need to know the material. You need to learn how to apply the material, so you're
Correct.
not flipping through pages trying to find a similar problem, because the exam is going to be over before you know it. So
Correct.
knowing the material is probably more important than if the exam is open book or closed book. And having an open book, obviously, as engineers, I have my steel manual, I have my codes, everything here on my desk all the time when I'm answering problems and
Hmm.
finding solutions. But I need to know how to apply the code. I need to find the limitations. I need to know how everything kind of comes together. If I don't know that, I'm going to spend hours on end looking for the answer that it may not be as obvious.
No, you're absolutely right. And great background you gave. And the reason why I brought that up is, so one of the questions I get a lot is is the exam going to be more difficult now that it's closed book, or more, or is it going to be easier? And I always tell
Mhm.
people, whenever, if I can remember going back to my college days, I actually found that open book exams were a little bit more difficult because one, professor's like, hey, you have access to everything. And but two is like, you're like, okay, I don't maybe need to study as hard because I have the book. But
Mhm.
you're right. If you're spending all this time flipping through the book, your time is done.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a good answer or not, but I'll ask you, you know, do you think that there's advantages or disadvantages of the exam going CBT?
Again, I think it depends on the individual person. Like I personally think it's great because you are able to search for different things in the
Hmm.
handbook. Again, you need to be conscious of the amount of time you're studying before the exam, making sure you understand the concept, making sure what you're looking for when you search, because
Hmm.
you can search for a concept, but it may throw you in a different part of the code that doesn't really apply to the question you're answering. But it may look from how they're asking the question that it applies, and then you answer that way and it's wrong. So it's more of understanding where the
Hmm.
concepts fit within the question they're asking you, and knowing what all is in that handbook, what all is in the code, and just finding the right section. In my case, I think it's a positive thing that you can search for this. It's a positive thing that you can have all the materials in one place, and
Hmm.
again, you need to be conscious of actually learning the material, knowing where everything is. For other people, they may just say, okay, everything is there, I can just search it, so I'm not going to study
Right.
that hard. So for them, it's actually a downside that you have that search functionality and having to having all the material at the disposal of just a command F. So
No, that makes sense. Because like even if let's say you're searching for the word geometrics, it
mhm.
might pull up 40 results. And if you have no clue what you're looking for, you're going to be like wasting your time going through 40 different results. So I don't think people should prepare any less, because just because you have a search function or whatever doesn't mean it's going to be
Yeah.
easier to find the stuff if you don't know what you're looking for. So I know, Luis, that you talk to people, you help people, kind of guide and mentor people, is that's preparing for FE or PE. Have you had anyone reach out to you that had questions about the computer based and what kind of experience? And if you have, what are some of the most common questions that you fielded?
Yeah, so there's been a few people that have just reached out. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I like helping students. I have a few guides and everything that people download and sound like they're being helpful. But I think one of the main questions is just kind of that open-ended question, like what's different about the CBT exam? Like what's new? What's different? I actually pulled 10 different things that changed from the paper and pencil exam into the CBT and just put it on my website. So I usually direct people to that, but again, it's just kind of what changed. I think the big one is like, what do I do about like the resources, the code? Like, do I need to bring a suitcase, especially for the structural part? We have so many codes. Do I still need to bring all those books? Do we like what can I bring to the testing center? I think is also a big one.
Hmm.
In terms of like snacks, water. Can I bring my phone, my watch? There's a lot of different logistical things around the P exam in general that not a lot of people realize until they actually are a month away from taking the exam. Like
Hmm.
for me, I just went to Walmart and got a $8 watch because I couldn't bring my smartwatch to the testing center. And I think that's important to know how much time you have left.
Yep.
Usually they have a watch on the wall, but sometimes they don't. So little things like that, I think people don't realize until they actually start looking into, okay, what do I need to do to prepare for the exam? A lot of people have the technical side, whatever that portion they're taking on the control. They have courses, they have all of that stuff. But is that before you actually get into the exam, how do they prepare? How do
Hmm.
they approach exam? I think this is one of the most common questions I get for sure.
No, that's very helpful. And you're right, because you want to know what you're walking into, right?
Hmm.
So let's say you put together a plan and you get to the exam testing center, and all of a sudden they're like, "Well, you can't take this, you can't have that." So now what you have prepared for is changed. So
Yeah.
people can panic, kind of lose their focus. So I think it's very important for everyone to have an understanding of what is allowed in the testing center and what they can bring. That way, there's no surprises. You don't want any last minute surprises, right?
Hmm.
You've worked hard preparing for the exam. You don't want something to come up and kind of put a hurdle in your direction. So no, that's some great advice, Luis.
Yeah, and
um,
just to add to that, if I may,
sure.
uh, practicing the way you're gonna take the exam, I think is super important. Like little things make a huge difference. For me, I took 3 full day exams the same way.
Hmm.
I got to the office. I drove on Saturday to the office, took exam from 8 to noon, took an hour lunch, and then exam from 1 to 5, and really focus on actually putting myself in that situation. And little things like what chair are you sitting on? The chair at the testing center may not be super comfortable. Is it going to be a wood chair? Are you going to be uncomfortable all morning? How are you going to feel as soon as you eat lunch and maybe you're a little tired? Do you need some coffee in the afternoon? Do you have access to those things? So those little things make a huge difference. And obviously, coming from just an athletic background, the way you practice should be the way you are competing. So practice in the same situations, only have your pen. And if you're taking online, obviously maybe you're just computer, but you just focus on that browser. Um, Things like snacks, maybe different water. When are you gonna go to the bathroom? For me, I just found like at that 2 hour mark, I would just step away for 50 minutes, get my thoughts back together and just go back. But I practice all of these things 3 times before I actually took the exam. So maybe sound a little ridiculous when you first think about it, but if you do all these things and you have everything under control, you're gonna see on the exam and you're gonna feel right at home, like if you sit on your own chair, and you're gonna feel more confident when you go through all those questions.
No, I mean, I think that's excellent. You're absolutely right. The way you practice is the way you're going to play. I remember when I was younger and we'd be at basketball practice, my dad would be like, don't take shots that you're not going to take during the game, right?
Yeah.
Don't learn bad habits because they're going to transition over into the game. But no, you're absolutely right. You want to kind of condition yourself for that marathon, right?
Hmm.
You don't want to practice things that you're not able to do during the actual exam because that's going to throw you off. So no, I agree.
Right.
I always tell students too is, I understand that it's difficult sometimes to find an 8 hour slot, right? To kind of
Hmm.
go through that whole walk through an exam experience. But I always tell people it's essential. Practice it. That way you can get an idea of how to manage the time. Or, like, oh man, I only got through, 70 questions instead of the 80 because I ran out of time. So you need to learn these things. So I think it's
Hmm.
very important to practice and prepare that way. Granted, the questions that you're practicing on are not questions you're going to come across on the exam, but at
Yeah.
least you can train yourself for that day and be ready for it. So I think that's excellent, Luis. Um, well, I'm looking through the questions today and looking at some recommended study materials, and I see that you have an ultimate PE exam study guide. What the heck is it? And if you want, talk about it.
Yeah. So again, taking the exam last year, I started creating a lot more content about the P exam. How do I prepare? What are the best ways to prepare for the exam? So I put up a few guides, a free guide for the P exam out. I think over 200 people have downloaded so far. I put my notes that I created for the summary of all the structural depth portion. Over 1,000 people have downloaded that. So there's definitely a lot of people that are really looking for this kind of information, for this kind of material. What I wanted to do was supplement what other people are doing, like what School of P is doing, providing the technical materials, and help students, help engineers study for those materials. So I'm not teaching any of the technical stuff. I'm not going into how to calculate stresses for a beam, how to calculate this hydrostatic pressure of a pipe. None of that stuff is really covered in the exam. It's more of how do you learn, helping you identify your learning style, helping you with your time management, and helping you create that plan to hopefully pass the exam in the first try. My goal is to have this experience with people the same way I did it. I
Hmm.
didn't sacrifice spending time with my family. I didn't sacrifice spending time with my friends during these studying sessions because I spread it out for 4 or 5 months.
Hmm.
And we teach a lot of the learning techniques in the course that are going to help you learn a lot faster and obviously not sacrificing your life while you start for the exam. This is the first thing you hear when you say, I'm going to start preparing for the exam. Everyone is like, you're gonna have to sacrifice so much, you're gonna have to put a lot of work. But in reality, if you're smart about it, if you use the time wisely, if you study the right things, using the right techniques to help you learn faster, you don't need to sacrifice a lot of these things. It's gonna take time, it's gonna take effort from your end. You need to be conscious of the time you put into study. But if you follow these things, if you follow these techniques, you're gonna have a great time during these study sessions.
That's pretty cool. And you bring up a good point. A lot of times people talk about the sacrifices they have to make, and I'm not just talking about PE or FE exam. People getting ready to go to med school or
Yep.
take their tests for their boards. They're always talking about sacrifice, but they're also making the whole, preparing for the exam seem like a miserable experience. But I agree with you. If you plan it properly, it doesn't have to be something that you're dreading.
Mhm.
I've actually found that if you can create a plan that is well thought out, and if you can execute it, you can actually make it a pretty enjoyable experience to where you're not missing out on things, or you're not beating yourself up over the head because you're preparing for this exam. So no, I think that's pretty cool, Luis. One question I see here, and I hear it too, is what you have, the exam specs, right?
Mhm.
So you know what topics are going to be in the exam, but that doesn't necessarily translate into how you should be studying, right? So is there a difference between how you should study in, or how to study, as opposed to what you should study?
Absolutely. I think there's certain things, kind of what we're talking about before, of the different type of questions you have now. So one of the things we teach in the course is just learning your learning style. So there's visual, there's auditory, there's reading and writing, and there's that kinesthetic learning style, which is more hands-on. So studying for any part of the exam using those learning styles. So for me, I like to write and I like to read. So if I use those techniques and I'm gonna create summaries and I'm gonna create resources and then apply some of the other just learning techniques like spaced repetition, these other techniques that are going to help you learn a lot faster, you're going to be able to get a better sense of what's in the exam. And then what I did when when I was studying for the exam was, okay, within these structure sections, which are the sections with 10 questions in a section, which are the one with 2 questions. Obviously I study more for the ones that are 10 questions within a section because there's a higher chance I'm going to have
Yep.
those questions. The other ones are, okay, I need to study, I need to know what's going on. But if you focus on studying smart and studying what you need to study and study what maybe is not as fresh in your mind, you're gonna make the most out of that time, as well as just seeing how different topics, different questions, different things kind of connect with each other. Because I feel like 50% of the exam is just knowing where to look in your brain for an
Mhm.
answer for the question. The technical side is not super complicated. The formulas are not super complicated, but it's tricky to know where to start with the problem. You need to know multiple background informations in order to answer a single question. So it kind of depends. I focus a lot more on those kind of higher end number of questions within the structural depth portion. Again, like I said, I focus probably 80-90% of my time studying for the depth portion.
No, that makes sense, and I appreciate you sharing that. So, as I know, we're kind of getting to the end of the podcast for the day. So, let me ask you this: so everyone's looking for, I don't know, maybe hints or tips,
Mhm.
or sometimes you're looking for a hack to try to get through the PE civil exam. So, what are some of your favorite hacks for passing the PE civil exam?
So I think one of the best ones, and it's a simple one. I think a lot of people have said this in everything that I have seen to just to take the exam is when you take the exam, obviously you can fast forward through questions and answer the ones you know first.
Hmm.
Then go back and do a second pass in maybe like the second tier, and then go back and do like the last pass. Because if you answer the most questions right away, you're gonna have a higher motivation. You're gonna feel better about
Yep.
yourself, and then you start going through the other questions harder. Obviously, the hardest one towards the end. Maybe you don't have time. Maybe you're just able to guess at the end. You don't get deducted any points for having a wrong answer, so
Yep.
there's no harm on just getting those towards the end. But I think it's a simple, basic one. And in terms of preparing, I think the best advice is just start early if you can. 4 months, I think, is the minimum. Again, you don't need to study 20 hours a day or 50, 60 hours a week to pass the exam. You just need to be smart about it, space it out, and you're going to be fine at the end of the day.
I agree. I work. What is it? Work smarter, not harder.
Yep.
Um, but no, I agree. I talk to people about when they're getting ready to take their PMP exam for project managers, and I'm like, when you go through the exam, grab the low hanging fruit first, right?
Hmm.
As you say, it builds some confidence, but plus you're getting those out of the way because it would really be horrible if, let's say, you've spent the 95% of the time and you got, like, let's say 10 questions or 12 questions left, and you're like, oh man, I'm running out of time, but these questions were easy, but you didn't
Hmm.
get to them because you were struggling to answer some of the more difficult questions earlier on in the exam. So
Yeah.
you leave some points on the board there. Agree. Don't leave a blank answer. Right. There is no penalty for an incorrect answer, or yeah. So incorrect answer. So put an answer for everything. So Luis, I appreciate you coming back out here today. Love to have you back. Any words of wisdom you want to share to the audience as the summer comes to an end?
I think it's a great time to kind of get back into that learning routine. I think this summer a lot of people don't like to study. I didn't study during the summer. I took it in April. But as we come out of the summer, the winter, I think those are my favorite times of
Yep.
study, of learning. You're kind of in the house and maybe it's a little cozy. You have a blanket on you and you just kind of focus on studying. But just in terms of the exam, I think a lot of people have that fear that it's a tough exam. It's hard. You have to study a lot. You have to put this many hours into it. You need to sacrifice all these things. But what I'm trying to do with my content is show the opposite. Like if you know how to study, if you know
Mhm.
where to study, it doesn't have to be that hard. You can have a semi regular life as you prepare for the exam, and at the end of the day, I think you're gonna be fine. If you don't pass it the first time, that's fine. Like a lot of people don't. Most people I talk to, they haven't passed it the first time. I don't remember the last time I asked my supervisor or a coworker, like, "Oh, did you pass the P exam the first time?" Because if you didn't, I don't think you're a good engineer. Like that's
Right.
not the whole point. Prepare well, stay calm, and just put the best effort, and you're gonna be fine.
100% agree with you, Luis. It's kind of like, let's say you're a doctor And let's say you just made it through med school. Maybe you're a C- student or whatever, but you pass your board, you're a doctor. No one's going to ask you like, "Hey, Luis, what were your grades in med school?" Right?
Right.
So same thing here. But the best thing about this is if you don't pass the exam, you're not having to wait 6 months to retake it. Get back on that
Absolutely.
horse and ride. So hey, Luis, thanks again for coming out. Everyone out there, have a wonderful rest of your week. And Luis, love to have you back here again. But again, thanks for coming back for round 2.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everyone out there, have a wonderful day.